We are going to get started to respect everyone's time. Thank you for all joining on time tonight. Just as a reminder, my name's Chris Schoon. I work for the Christian Reformed Church as the Director of Faith Formation Ministries. And I'm going to open us up in a word of prayer just for our time tonight. And then Eric Koss from Safe Church Ministries, Eric's waving there, is going to get us started and kind of lead us into our evening together. So let me pray. God, you are good and faithful. You are so generous to us, and we thank you for that. We thank you for your deep, abiding love in Jesus Christ and for your constant presence with us in the Holy Spirit. We pray that you indeed would be with us tonight, that our time might be an encouragement to us as we look at growing in intergenerational mentoring, as we look to equip our churches and create environments where people can flourish together. Lord, we pray that your spirit would be among us, leading us in this space tonight. Guard our hearts, our emotions, our minds, our bodies as we gather. Lead us in this space, we pray, in the good and faithful name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Eric, over to you.
All right, thanks, Chris, and thanks to the Gen Spark team for this time together. We are so excited to be here, even though it's an evening and maybe some of us are starting to get a little sleepy. And I'm hoping my children are in bed at home, but anyway, I think Becky will be sharing the PowerPoint that we have, and we will start our presentation. We would love to get to know each of you a bit better as well, and hopefully create more connections between all of you who are taking on new mentoring ministries and with support through Gen Spark. So if it's all right, if we share the next slide. And share your name, where you're from, and one sentence that excites you about Generation Spark. And I'll just go first since I'm here. And my name is Eric Koss. I'm a consultant with Safe Church Ministry, and I've been working with Safe Church for just about 5 years. And I started out in this work with doing it bivocationally while planting a church out of our home. And so it's good, and we transitioned from that once our second child was born, and it's been really good to continue to focus on abuse prevention, awareness, and response. And so I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and what excites me about Gen Spark is I just wish something like this was at the church that I grew up in, that people actually connected meaningfully, and those relationships were a part of the culture of the church. And so that's what excites me about Gen Spark, and to hear all of you taking this on and pioneering it in your ministries. I will go over to, why don't we do the Safe Church team first, and then I'll put a list of people in the chat. So I'll turn it over to Becky and then Amanda.
Hey, I'm Becky. So I've been with Safe Church for a couple of years now, and I'm a volunteer and communications specialist with Safe Church. I also work with disability concerns, and I am working out of Burlington, Ontario. So I'm the Canadian part of our team. And what excites me about working with Gen Spark is your team. I have come to love all of them on the team. I'm very excited to be once again being a part of being connected with Gen Spark. And I'm going to hand it over to Amanda now.
All right. Well, thank you, Becky. My name is Amanda Benkhausen, and I am the director of Safe Church Ministry. I'm actually the newbie to the team. So I just started this position a little over a year ago. And prior to that, I actually taught Old Testament in 2 different seminaries. So this is a little bit of a change, but I'm really passionate about helping our churches be safer and healthier places. So that drew me to this role that I'm in now. I am currently operating out of the Grand Rapids office, so I live in Grand Rapids. And what excites me about Gen Spark is I have 2 teenage daughters, and I am so grateful for the adults who have poured into their lives and mindful of how much they have benefited from those relationships, and to see the church assume a kind of helpful way of ushering churches into that kind of relationship where they can establish those relationships between adults and youth. That's really exciting to me. So I'm excited about the program.
Thanks, Amanda. And I just put the order of people. And if you would like to pass, feel free to pass. But if you could share your name, where you're from, and what in one sentence that excites you about Gen Spark. If it goes over one sentence, it's okay too.
So I think we're first.
Yes.
So my name's Presley.
And I'm Matt.
And we're in Thunder Bay, Ontario. So I know you guys are saying you guys just got a bit of snow. We just got a whole lot of snow.
Yeah, 16 inches of snow.
A lot of snow. I thought winter was over. And something that excites me about Generation Spark is just helping other people foster those like really meaningful relationships in the church community. I know I grew up in Montreal in the CRC there, and had some great relationships with people in the church, and I'd like to be a part of helping others develop that.
Yeah. And I like working with the youth, so I'm kind of excited about that, and getting their opinion and helping them to stay within the church and everything else. So
Great. Well, thank you, Matt and Chris. So we'll go to Travis next.
My name, excuse me, my name is Travis Durr. I'm in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis area in Minnesota. And I've been reading recently on Identity, Belonging, and Purpose, one of the new Fuller books, and thinking about Generation Spark. And I can see where this would address all 3 of those areas for the youth of our church. So I'm excited to mix some of that learning together.
All right. Thanks, Travis. Next, Angela.
My name is Angela Geisen, and I'm from Thunder Bay, Ontario as well with Matt and Presley. I'm the Congregational Life Coordinator for CRC here. And I've been working with our high school youth group like forever. And also what I am excited about for Generation Spark is after going through some of the training, it allowed me to take a look at all the things we do really well, and just trying here at First CRC and integrating those things better so that we can have those intergenerational relationships. And like Travis, I also am involved in a lot of worship planning here, and I'm really exploring a lot with intergenerational worship too. So I think that overlap is pretty exciting.
Yeah, and I'm Peter Geisen, Angela's husband. And yeah, I've worked with the youth for quite some time and been a youth elder and stuff like that. And it's been always a passion of mine to, I guess, to minister to the youth and to encourage them to be part of the church, whether it's through catechism teaching, etc. But something that has always been what I always have believed in, I guess, is exactly what this course is about. And that is the intergenerational relationship between young and old. And I've always thought that there can be a huge benefit for both parties to learn, and also a need, like a want from both young and old. And it's just something we've done a little bit here and there, some different, having people come into our youth groups, and it really worked well. The kids, they told their stories and stuff, but we never really went much farther than that. And so that's why I do believe in this program, and I believe it will work 100%. So yes.
right, next Sally, and then Christina after that.
Oh, good evening. I'm Sally Buss, and I'm from the same church as Travis. We are in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And what really excites me about this ministry is that I have been working cross-culturally with a lot of Southeast Asian students, but now have just recently started a huge program that's over in the Ukraine, and we're working with students from around the world right now. And so the exciting part for me is to hear the stories of our students and to help build them up. I think that one of the most important things that we can do is to come alongside our youth and help mentor them and help guide them, because they have many questions, and especially our students that are from other places in the world, as they come into our metro area, have questions about, life in a metro area in a much different place than they've ever experienced.
Mm-hmm. Next, Christina, are you?
Hi, I'm Christina. I'm in Victoria, British Columbia. So we have no snow here. What excites me about Generation Spark is I'm really looking forward to getting the chance to make these connections with the teens. I know whenever I was a teen, I had an adult in my church that I got together with all the time, and it was such a great experience for me. So I'm looking forward to passing that on.
Thank you. And next, Sean. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Sean May. I'm from Seymour Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And what excites me about the Generation Spark is knowing how important those intergenerational relationships were in my faith story. And so I am excited to be a part of creating new stories.
Thanks, John. And Pastor Kelly, are you able to share?
She just chatted in.
Great.
Oh, Kelly, it sounds like you're unmuted now. Great. Go ahead.
It sounds like we're having difficulty hearing you, but we appreciate you sharing via chat. And maybe we could go to Debbie next for our last. All right, I think we'll turn it back over to Amanda and share a little bit more about who we are as Safe Church Ministry.
All right, well, thank you, Eric. So you may be wondering who Eric and Becky and I are. We are not actually with Generation Spark, but we were invited to partner with Generation Spark as Safe Church Ministry, recognizing that there is something beautiful and wonderful about having mentoring relationships between older adults and younger and youth, or having these kinds of intergenerational relationships, but recognizing that those relationships also have certain vulnerabilities. And so we were invited in to address those vulnerabilities so that we could ensure that this program had the best chance of being something that people could trust, that it felt safe, and that this is a program that they could feel good about and really invest in, because we have taken the proper precautions to address those vulnerabilities. So we are with Safe Church Ministry of the Christian Reformed Church, and we are a ministry that equips congregations in abuse awareness, prevention, and response. And so that's really what we're here to do tonight, in terms of, and with the specific context in mind, of intergenerational mentoring relationships.
Thanks, Amanda. So why focus on abuse prevention, and why are we spending Thursday evening talking about some of the abuse prevention for mentoring ministries, the do's and don'ts of mentoring ministries? And so I put very first tab here, it's not the most fun, but now I say it's not the most fun because that's often how people initially think. I've actually, when people ask me what I do for work, I'm often a little bit hesitant. I'm like, I don't know how this is going to be received. And then I just go for it. I do abuse prevention, awareness, and response in the church. And it depends on who I'm talking to and what expression I get. I remember one person who's doing some work in my basement. I had they were doing some rough-in electrical, and I was framing some walls. And they said, oh, you're kind of handy. Like, where'd you learn how to do that? And we talked, and then they said, well, what do you do now? And I said, well, abuse awareness. Says, that doesn't sound fun at all. and I think that's the impression we get when we think about abuse, and we think, do we really want to focus on this? Do we need to? But as I've continued this work, I've realized it really is one of the most loving things we can do. Because when you do hear about the stories about how people have been affected by abuse, both the person who has been victimized, and also all of those who are connected to that person, including the church and the community, the effects of abuse are so deep and wide, and it's something that affects the reputation of the church and people's perception of the gospel for such in a way that is really hard for people to continue to put their trust in not only church and leaders, but also their trust in Christ. And so how do we as the church continue to go forward in ways that are really safe, dignifying, respectful, and that could prevent something that does so much damage? How do we convey that kind of love and be that as the church? And so I have an analogy that I've been working with this week, and so Amanda and Becky have heard it a few times now, but a week ago I replaced our hot water heater, and I didn't know exactly why it broke. It was an older hot water heater, and they have a lifespan, but then I realized what I did to actually break it, because about a year ago I realized our water pressure was so high in our house. And so I thought, this is going to, if this water pressure continues, it's going to break a lot of the faucets that I have. It's going to limit their lifespan. So I put this pressure regulation valve, or a pressure regulator, on our water supply in our house. And it brought the PSI of the water down from 90 to about 60. And I thought, great, this is wonderful. But what I didn't realize is it was creating a closed system in our house. And so before, when our hot water heater heated the water and it built pressure in the system, all of the excess pressure would actually go back out into the street water supply. And it would take on the pressure. And with it being limited by that pressure regulator, now all of that pressure needed to go somewhere, and it was being held in the water tank itself until it popped. Too much pressure. And it blew through the bottom. And so I realized, while I was installing the new hot water heater, that they made something called a thermal expansion tank. And so as the water heats up in a closed system, it's actually able to take on the extra pressure and release it back into the system once that pressure is limited. And when I think about abuse prevention and think about mentoring ministries, it's something that's so healthy. I think it's something that we need as the church to create really great relationships. But at the same time, there are times when we add risk to our ministries. And so me putting on that pressure regulator added a risk to my hot water heater that I didn't really understand until it blew. And so how can we as the church and leaders do something that's really good in mentoring ministries and catalyze this, but also realize the other risks that are coming alongside of it? How can we create safe systems where people can really thrive, and where each mentor, especially the mentee, is able to dive deeper in their faith and share vulnerably, but do so in ways that do not put them at greater risk. And so how do we create that system? Which is what we're here for tonight. And you know, the other reason we're here, I think, also is that Generation Spark, we have a big generation leaving the church, right? And I think I'm part of that generation. And I think it's a really great hope and goal for us to connect with a younger generation. But another top reason why a younger generation is leaving the church is because abuse issues continue to come out. Month after month, we see new news stories. We had several just in the past 3 weeks. One being Bruxy Cavey at the Meeting House, and Becky Jones actually a part of the Meeting House, and she's been personally affected by that. And then also Christianity Today, one of their key editors for so many years, Mark Galley, and another friend of mine was talking about how Mark Galley's work was so influential in his life. And we continue to hear stories of Bill Hybels, Ravi Zacharias, Mark Driscoll, and the list goes on and on. So how can we as the church continue to put safeguards into our ministries and go forward in ways that are truly dignifying and uphold the gospel of the good news of Christ, and create intergenerational ministries and relationships that hopefully people are not able to be victimized by abuse. And so in this Me Too age, and hashtag church too, and hashtag silence is not spiritual, how can we talk about this and put these kinds of safeguards into our ministry? Next slide is all about myth busting. And I think a lot of us have different ideas or prejudices about abuse, how it happens in our churches and lives. And so we're hoping to break some of those myths that we might have. And Becky will go first here with stranger danger.
Talk about stranger danger. And we were putting this together. I was like, oh my gosh, do you remember this book? But I am older than Eric, so no, he did not. Never Talk to Strangers. It was like the book that I read so many times as a little kid. It was super cute. It's all this who you don't talk to. You're like at the park, at the zoo, everywhere. And it's all these animals that you can't talk to because they are strangers and they're dangerous. But the unfortunate thing about this conversation, first of all, it scared me. I'm a very quiet person. I just didn't go anywhere and didn't talk to people because of it. But also, it didn't really get at the real issue in terms of the fact that, like, it's your danger is more regarding the people that are close to you, that you know, that you feel comfortable with. That is where you're going to find systemically the most danger happens. So, you know, great book, but it didn't really get to the point of what I needed to know for my life. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I think I'm up for myth number 2. Talking about abuse assumes mistrust of people in our churches. And I can't tell you how many times I will go around to churches and they will say, we don't need an abuse prevention policy, or we don't need a safe church policy because we all trust each other here. And by actually talking about abuse prevention, we make people upset because it makes them feel like we don't trust them. And I guess what I try to communicate in those situations is that actually abuse prevention is an act of love and hospitality to those both in our midst and those who want to be in our midst but are unsure. When we take the measures that we need to take to kind of give them a sense of that we take seriously the desire to protect their dignity and their value, then we communicate our love for them and that we're willing to sort of put aside ourselves in order to make them feel safe and comfortable. So it really is an act of hospitality and love to people to engage in this work of abuse prevention.
Mm-hmm. The next myth is abuse is mostly about sexual abuse. And when it comes to sexual abuse, every time there is sexual abuse between those of different levels of power, and specifically someone who is a church leader or even a significant member of their family, there's always emotional abuse that has taken place. And often that kind of grooming process comes before any type of sexual abuse happens. Because as Becky mentioned, it's not necessarily stranger danger, but most of the time we have abuse happening within family systems or other trusted friends, or often an older peer as well. Or somebody else staying in the house who their little brother or has a friend over or something like that. That's another person who is trusted in the family. They're just always here and there. And so that grooming process happens. There is a slow process of gaining trust, and the person comes to rely on them, and before they know it, then a sexual abuse may happen. And then there's not only sexual abuse, but there's other types of abuse, emotional abuse that continues on, that exploits somebody who is more vulnerable. And so different examples of this is creating a culture as a leader that continues to assume one's power over the other. And there's a kind of exploitation that continues on, and that doesn't include any kind of sexual abuse, but continues in that form. So that's another myth that we have.
And then the final one, focusing on abuse prevention will turn people and volunteers away. So a lot of my time has been spent as a volunteer coordinator, working with volunteers. And I think what I've learned over the years is like volunteers, I was at a gallery before this, when they come in, a lot of the volunteers I was working with have worked with other organizations, and they know the expectation of other organizations, that you have policies in place, that you expect that you're going to be having police checks. And that's just a general expectation. And so to not have that as a church, I just think that that is just such a misstep, because we should be not only equal, but above other organizations, and showing our example of, to me, that is equaling love, that we are making sure that we are doing everything we can to prevent abuse. And also from the perspective of being a mom, right? Like when I'm going into organizations, when I'm dropping my kids off for church programs or any other program within the community, my expectation is that the people that I am entrusting my kids with have been vetted properly, and that I can be trusting that organization. And so there is that level of expectation that I hold that that we need to have for the church. So it's very important.
All right, now we will move over to some scenarios, which include some of the myths that we've shared, and we hope for some participation here. And so I will be reading the first scenario, and then we'll be asking some questions like, identify who might hold the power in the situation, and identify some important factors that might be considered, and then how might the situation have been prevented. All right, I'm going to read this first scenario. Katie's parents finally convinced her to go to the church youth group, and she had always been more introverted, preferring to read or color than play with other kids growing up. She was now turning 15, and she struggled with self-esteem and relationships. To Katie's parents' surprise, she actually liked youth group. Katie connected well to Heather, a youth leader who struck up a conversation the first night she attended. Soon they began monthly one-to-one mentoring, and Heather would even pick her up from school with her parents' permission. But then they would text often, sometimes in the middle of the night. And Heather made it her personal goal to give Katie the mental health help she needed. Soon the parents voiced concern to the church leadership. So we're going to identify a little bit more about what some factors in this situation, and then I'll also add a little bit more to this story after we've done that, to show some warning signs that might have been here, and then how a situation like this developed. So who holds the power in the situation?
How do you want people to respond, Eric?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. You can share verbally, or you can type that in the chat, and we can echo the things that are in the chat. So either or is fine. Maybe we'll take those first two questions. Identify some important factors that you might consider, might be considered, and identify who holds the power.
For the second question, you need to identify some boundaries. Sounds like mom and dad were on board with some of the one-on-one, but texting at all hours of the night or communication at all hours of the night, there should be some agreed upon boundaries between, I think it was Heather and mom and dad, and what can happen and when.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, with we've had a few situations about, and maybe this would be an example of something that wasn't sexual abuse, but there was a different level of emotional abuse going on and boundary crossing that was not appropriate between a mentee and mentor. And so in a situation like this, Katie actually had a lot of mental health challenges going on in her life, in and out of residential care in some instances, and Heather continued to pursue Katie and in ways that actually were not appropriate, and she continued to share different things about her own self, emotional disclosures about her own life that wasn't appropriate for a 15-year-old, and expected the same kind of emotional sharing by Katie, expecting that she could give the kind of counseling and mental health help that Katie actually needed. And so she, in many ways, she superseded some of the expert help and support in that Katie was actually given. And I know we didn't explain everything that was involved in the situation, but we tried to point out some items of how a mentoring relationship might continue to develop, and how it could cross boundaries that are there for a really good reason.
Eric, Christina noted some of these things in the chat, and I just wanted to mention that she wrote, I think it's troubling that the youth leader wanted to be the one to help out with all her mental health, with all her mental health issues. And that sounds like something that is outside the purview of her role as a youth leader. And I think that's exactly right. Heather wanted to be all things to her, but Heather wasn't necessarily invited to be all things to her, and didn't have the tools and the skills needed, and didn't have actually her parents' permission, Katie's parents' permission to do that. So yes.
Mm-hmm. How might this situation have been prevented?
Parents could have entered in a little bit and said no texting in the middle of the night. I mean, just, putting some parameters around the communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, do your churches have any policy around texting and communications by youth leaders? That'd be something I'd be curious about.
So again, Christina wrote, our church has a rule that you can't text outside normal calling hours unless it's an emergency, which is a great policy to have.
That's kind of been my approach too. 9 to 9, don't, not too early, not too late.
Absolutely.
It's interesting with policies. One of the things you want to do is make use of the tools that are so helpful when connecting with youth, right? Youth text these days. They don't use email, they don't use the phone, but they text. And so we want to make sure that our policies understand the culture of our youth and but at the same time put boundaries and limitations around how we use that. So we use it well, and again, for the flourishing of those in whom we're in communication with. And so this is just one of those prime examples. We at Safe Church have wrestled long and hard with policies around e-communications because we don't want them to be so restrictive that they prevent good connections between people, right? But recognizing there needs to be something in place. So
we will be sharing the policy that we sent ahead of time, and I think the one-to-one communications, I think viewing that in some ways as similar to the one-to-one meetings is really helpful, so that we understand the kind of space that is, that especially as somebody who is a minor, as they're connecting with someone who's an adult, and especially somebody who has a position or a higher level of influence or power around themselves, because that kind of communication will be very different than a one-to-one communication with a peer. And so just being mindful of how they're being received and what's appropriate for that boundary and what's not. I saw there was another chat. Every time I move my chat off, I see. Yeah, and so a key difference between mental health counselor and what we do as ministry, and what the mentor is called to do in these relationships. And we'll get to some of that as well when there is a duty to report about something, or there is some concern coming forward by the mentee about how to assist them and support them appropriately. Okay, we'll move on to the next scenario. This one is titled "A Youth Group Situation." Sarah, or I think Becky was going to read this one. So.
Sarah was 15 years old and loved youth group. She was always eager to attend and invited her friends. She was extroverted, and some even made fun of her for being so outgoing. The youth group itself was quite large, averaging around 30 high school students, and they always needed more adult leaders. Tom had graduated a few years earlier and enjoyed the time he had spent at youth group as a student, so he volunteered to be a leader and quickly struck up a friendship with Sarah. Soon, Tom even began volunteering to transport Sarah back home after youth group, and she thought it was convenient, so accepted. A few months later, Sarah refused ever going to youth group again, and seemed cut off of many relationships. She refused to talk to her parents, and eventually she saw a counselor. Eventually, she disclosed that Tom began to make sexual advances towards her. She felt overwhelming guilt having done the things she did. So again, we're going to look at some questions related to this scenario. Okay, so we're going to look at the same questions. I'll just read them through and then we can look at them. So identify who holds the power in this situation. Identify some of the important factors that must be considered. What might be a good response in this situation? How might this situation have been prevented? What was the impact on the person victimized? And finally, what do they need to move forward? So the first one, I'm just going to open it up to the group, is identify who holds the power in this situation.
And Becky, could you go back one slide to show the situation again? And then I did put the questions in the chat.
So there's overwhelming consensus that it's Tom.
Okay,
Tom holds the power, and absolutely.
Sorry, I don't remember the question. I'm not able to look at the chat. Identify some of the important factors that must be considered.
It could be that Tom hadn't been vetted as a leader, even though he had been part of the youth group, that maybe there should have been an interview early on. I know as a psychologist, I would not want to bring a leader in without having really gotten to know that person to make sure that they were safe.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think that's a growing trend, but it hasn't been a common practice in the past in churches that you vet your volunteers. Most churches are just thrilled to pieces when they get enough people showing up as volunteers to execute their ministries. But especially with youth, you want to take the precautions to vet your volunteers well. And so as part of the policy, we've included things like an application for youth and to be a mentor, and a sign up form for getting a background check and things like that, so that you could do that proper screening. So Chris said the youth group always needs more leaders. Like, that's another important consideration in this situation. And again, that kind of goes to this idea that often churches are kind of scrambling for leaders, and that leaves them vulnerable because it means that they're not necessarily properly vetting their leaders.
Yeah, that transportation piece in that one-to-one space, there's actually a lot of control that happens when a volunteer leader, even if they're a couple, 3 or 4 or 5 years older than the student, they have control of the car, they have control of everything in that given moment. And we've actually found that's a common situation in that confined space where something, a major boundary was crossed and there was some type of abuse.
Okay, I'm going to go to the next question. Sorry, I can't see the screen otherwise, the chat. What might be a good response in this situation?
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, you discover that this has been happening. Maybe Sarah discloses to someone other than her counselor. What do you do with that information?
Mm-hmm.
We have a need to report, actually, if we suspect that there's any abuse.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think in Canada, everyone is a mandatory reporter. That's not necessarily true in the States, but one of the things that in the Christian Reformed Church, we are encouraging through a code of conduct is that everyone who is an ordained ministry leader, whether they're an office bearer, an elder or deacon, or a pastor, that they are then sign on to a code of conduct which makes them a mandatory reporter, or by which they commit to being a mandatory reporter. And it's not a bad idea to actually have your ministry staff and volunteers do the same, just so that there's consistency, that everyone becomes a mandatory reporter when there is harm done, when you suspect harm being done to a minor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this speaks to what you said earlier about churches who think that it's uncomfortable to talk about it, or it's not necessary, because if you don't have a policy in place for how you're going to deal with a situation like this, what are you supposed to do after the fact when something like this happens? If you don't have a protocol as to how to investigate or who gets called into that, then you're in a much messier spot than having the initial conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, and a lot of misconduct goes unreported precisely because people don't know how to report it, or when they tell someone, that person gives them a hard time or says, oh, that's not a big deal, or minimizes what happened, or all kinds of things happen, right? And so there needs to be some clarity around how can you report in a way that that report is going to be dealt with and treated seriously. So those processes need to be clear and they need to be in place.
I think one of the times that it becomes kind of cloudy is educators, at least in our state, are mandated reporters. And oftentimes we have people who are volunteering who are educators. So they know immediately they turn it in to the state. When we have people who don't understand what to do, they might in turn tell a friend, which is not going to go where it needs to go. And so I think, as you're saying, the education is really, really important. What do you do? How do you turn in that report? And that we require that you do it. Don't come and tell the pastor, you turn it in right now yourself.
Yeah.
I know part of our safety training policy is recognizing signs of abuse also. So I think in this scenario too, maybe someone could have picked up on something before it escalated to the point it was, if they were trained to look for those things too.
Yeah. That was my last question. How might this situation have been prevented? And you jumped right into that. So thank you.
Yeah, we've actually included it at the end of the safe mentoring policy, a list of signs that you could look for in if you suspect abuse. These are the kinds of things, indicators that you might see in the behaviors of or on the bodies of certain persons. It's sort of reflected both in embodied form and in their demeanor. So hopefully that is helpful.
Yeah, I think, again, a lot of these situations, it doesn't just finally happen. There is a pattern of behavior. Somebody who doesn't want to log, their one-to-one ministry meetings, or there's some pushback, or you see actually a character change in the younger person, and if it just goes unnoticed, then they, it may continue. But there are always different flags, red flags, and different signs that do come up. And so to be attentive to them, I think is so key, especially as the mentoring director, to be able to reach out to them and provide a point of contact and to ensure that things are still going well for them, so that there is somebody else other than just that mentor that they can easily reach out to. They know that if they have a concern, they could easily say, hey, I'm not sure if this is going well or not. And so we've also worked in that to the policy as well. All right. Any other questions that anybody has on these before we move on?
So Chris asked a really good question. He said, we're focusing on training for volunteers. What about training for youth to recognize signs and how to express concerns?
Yeah, we often emphasize through a Circle of Grace program, which is kind of a body safety program for kids from 5 years old all the way up to high school, to start talking about their own bodies, what's appropriate, who's the trusted adult that they can share. And so there's age appropriate lessons for each person. And by high school, I think I'm remembering Mary Holst, who's a chaplain at Calvin University, who talked about why young people are leaving the church. And one of the top things is we don't talk about sexuality. So how can young people, or even in mentoring ministry, talk about their own bodies or things that they are seeing amongst their peers, so that they can actually help well too. And so obviously that's a little bit out of the parameters that we have for tonight. But I think it's just such a helpful thing to not only empower our leaders, but also empower our younger people, and because they're the people who will see it and hear about it primarily. And so the leaders and others we kind of hear things secondarily through what we see in other things. So I think it's a great point, Chris.
Yeah, I actually had a call from a youth pastor not long ago who talked about some disconcerting behaviors that one of the youth was exhibiting, over-sexualized behaviors. And we talked about some of the strategies that this youth pastor could take. Some of the young women in the group were actually a little nervous about this young lad who was exhibiting these behaviors. And so it made the whole group feel uncomfortable. And so we talked about some strategies, but one of the strategies was you could do some education around what is appropriate behaviors, what are appropriate behaviors as youth in terms of your own sexuality, in terms of your bodies, from a Christian perspective. And I think that would be welcome by the youth to have an opportunity to talk about it. And it would send a message to everyone in the group, this is what's appropriate. And if you're not engaging in these behaviors in appropriate ways, then the youth pastor is a safe person to talk to about that, right? And so they incorporated into their youth ministry an education program around basic human sexuality and sexual behaviors. And so that seemed to be actually going fairly well for them, for that church. All right. I just want to sort of summarize all the things we're talking about in terms of thinking about not just sexual abuse, but the power differential between the mentor and the mentee. As much as we want to say these are about intergenerational relationships and we're coming alongside each other and we're learning from each other, when there's an age difference, there is a power differential, right? And when there's a gender difference, there's a power differential. Power is sort of given in our society in a variety of ways and through a variety of demographic characteristics, etc. It's also given in terms of your position. If you hold a position in the church, you have more power than someone who doesn't. And so it's worth considering the power differential between the mentor and the mentee. And one way that power is expressed is in terms of the church sort of giving its stamp of approval to a mentor to engage in this relationship with a mentee. And so the mentee, and I would assume the parents of the mentee, assume that the church is doing that because they trust the mentor. They trust the mentor as someone who can provide spiritual formation to the youth. That person is trusted as someone who holds spiritual authority, and so when a mentor cultivates a relationship with a mentee, that mentee feels like they can look to the mentor for wisdom and guidance and teaching and comfort and support. And all of that looking to the mentor and that trust that is sort of invested in the mentor is tied to the church and done in the name of Jesus, right? The mentoring is done in the name of Jesus. One way to think about this is as a sacred trust. The power that the mentor holds is a sacred trust. Ministry leaders or mentors are given a rare privilege of being invited to care for the soul of another. This is a sacred trust, a rare chance to make a difference. So that's like this beautiful thing, right? That a mentor holds the sacred trust and can pour into the mentee because of the trust that is given in that relationship. but it's also a weighty thing. And the reason to attend to this imbalance of power and recognize it is because when we don't recognize it, and when we're not intentional about it, and we don't recognize the responsibility that comes with this gift, we're more inclined to misuse it. So when this sacred trust is stewarded well, it leads to the flourishing of the youth. But when mentors use their influence and their power to serve themselves at the expense of or to the detriment of the mentee, they violate or break that trust. And that can happen through what we might consider like obvious violations, sexual misconduct. But it also happens, and I think this goes back to what Eric was talking about earlier, that abuse is not only sexual abuse. It can happen through comments that erode the dignity of a person, or through the misuse of scripture or faith to demean a person or make them feel bad about themselves. I was reflecting today on how words coming from different people make such a difference. And I think this sort of this example accentuates the way that power figures into our relationships with people. But if my kids said to me, for instance, "Mom, you're a terrible mom." Now, I hope my kids never say that to me, but if they do, well, actually, they did when they were little, you know, they were 4, they would say things like, "You're a terrible mom," or "You're a bad mom," you know, and kids say that. And as a mom, you can kind of absorb it because it's your kid, you know, and you know, they're acting out and behaving in ways that, you know, you need to train them up to help them understand how to conduct themselves better. And that's your responsibility. And they're not always going to receive you well. But if my mother said to me, "You're a terrible mom," I could tell you that would hurt, right? Like that would be so painful to hear from her. And so I think that just that example points to the way that when you hold power in a relationship, even your comments can have just such a huge impact. And so if we want to steward our trust well, or steward that power well, I think we need to be conscious and intentional about the ways in which we speak and the ways in which we act to ensure that the things that we're doing are actually for the flourishing of the youth and not for ourselves, right? And as Eric mentioned earlier, the impact when there is this kind of misuse of power or violation of trust is significant, because this mentoring relationship, this imbalance of power is actually given the stamp of approval by the church. And so the mentee associates the actions of the mentor, not just with the person, but with Christianity, with the church, and with God, right? And so that's where the harm is so profound and pronounced. So all of this suggests that it's really important for mentors to be conscientious about the ways in which they exercise their power in the relationship with the mentee, and to recognize that this is a sacred trust, and that it's really the onus is on them to maintain healthy boundaries and appropriate interactions with the mentee. All right, Eric, I'm going to turn it back to you. Oh, Becky, sorry.
Yeah, I'm going to take over for a bit. I'm going to just talk a little bit, and then I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you a little bit when I talk as well. But we also wanted to talk about the concept of active and passive bystanders. So I don't know if you have heard of the bystander effect. But basically, it's the concept of the greatest number of people present, the less likely people are to help a person in distress. So just to give you an example, I think of my time, I lived in Toronto for a number of years, and just a very active, busy city. There was a time when my husband and I were on the subway going home, and there was a big fight that broke out in the middle of the subway. And there was actually very few of us that were on the subway. So a few of us just pressed the emergency button to stop the train as soon as they could. And, people came to deal with it. But if it had been in a busier situation, like at a busier time of day, who would have actually pressed the button, right? Like, would we have all just assumed that someone else was doing it because there's so many of us that were seeing the situation? So that's kind of the idea of the bystander effect. So when we're in situations, are we just assuming that if we're seeing someone in distress within our community, are we just assuming that someone else is in caring for it? And so we want to really encourage you to think about being in the position of an active bystander. So the idea is that we always have choices. So we can decide to do something and become an active bystander, or we can simply let it go and remain a passive bystander. So I'm just going to stop sharing so I can actually see you guys and chat a bit more about it. So I wanted to give a couple scenarios about it. So the first one for an active bystander is sort of a simpler one that happened in my world a little while ago, that I think you could see in any community situation. I sort of live in a smaller area within a city. We had a small little grocery store. I walked in one day, and when I walked in, you could just feel that something was different, like people were quiet, something was happening. It's a very small space. And so, I grabbed a couple things and just walked to the cash. And immediately, as soon as I was there, I realized that there was a very aggressive individual having an encounter with the cashier and really having a dispute over plums. Like, it was very simple, but he was very angry, and it was very, very uncomfortable. And it was interesting to witness that all of us literally were just pausing, right? And just witnessing the experience. And eventually the manager came to the scenario, but it took me a while. Like, I went home and just reflected over, could I have done more, right? Because I'd taken the training a little while ago on being an active bystander, what was my responsibility? Except in that situation, I felt what I was doing was as much as I could do. And when I thought back to the experience, I realized when I looked at all the cashiers, all of them were teenagers, all of them were female. The rest of us, there was literally all of us were female, except for the one male that was arguing. And the manager that came in was male. And all of us just stood calmly and just stood. No one moved. No one left the store, nothing. So when you're looking at active bystander, one of the tools is just that space of witness, right? Someone had already called for the manager to come, and everybody stood their ground. No one left the person in that situation, but just made a circle around her. So, there was that protection level, and yet none of us could intervene without having made it worse until the manager came. So that's a simple, easier version. The second one I'm going to explain is totally to do with the church, and a situation that I was in a number of years ago that is complex. And I still think about it to this day and look at, just all the tools that we have within our community now as a ministry of Safe Church, and what was ridiculously lacking 25 years ago, right? So I was in a youth group at a church where we had a new youth leader come in. He was young, he was not married, very attractive, and there was a very about 5-year age difference, right? The prior youth pastor had been much older and with children and married. And so I had left to go off to university, and I came back to volunteer on the weekends for this youth group. And so I actually dated him for a short period of time, and then he cut it off. And then I watched as he just went around to a group of females in the church, all within a specific age group. And I remember sitting in Tim Hortons one day with a bunch of my friends and looking around and thinking, wow, you've dated most of us, right? And just leaving the Tim Hortons thinking, this is not right. I don't know how to put it as not right. I don't know what is actually happening, because you're 19 and you're so young, right? And at that point, we didn't have things in place like a code of conduct that was like non-existent. I don't know what kind of policies the church had. I know as a volunteer coming in, I certainly wasn't, made aware of any sort of policies. But then, so thinking about it after all these years of working with Safe Church and just, thinking about it over the years, I reached out to one of the other youth leaders, right? And I called her and I said, I have to talk to you about this, because I feel you played a very pivotal role in this without me actually realizing, right? And so she clearly had seen the situation for what it was, as she was another youth leader working alongside him, but in a volunteer position. And she started protecting all of us. And you could just see her working within the group and sort of just working and pulling the girls into their own communities, making sure, like, we talked a fair bit about it. It was she worked intentionally without a lot of tools that the church had provided her, but just working within her space as an active bystander, being able to do what she could in a situation that, wasn't very great. And so I just think now we have a lot more tools available to us, but we still have to play that very active role of recognizing when something isn't right and figuring out with the role that we have, what is our responsibility and what can we do that we can, to some level, intervene. And so, so it was great. I got to thank her for caring in a way that I hadn't really thought about, like, many years later. But I just think there's a big responsibility for all of us within your roles to be able to just be constantly aware and just paying attention to what is happening and figuring out what your role can be, realizing we have policies and procedures in place, but constantly, watching for situations such as that when they're occurring. I'm going to go back and share my screen again. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Becky, and thanks, Amanda. We're going to have some policy time. And so this is the policy we've been working on, informed by a lot of the things that we've discussed already tonight. And so I'm going to work through it fairly quickly, and then give you the opportunity to ask any questions you might have. And so I don't know, are you able to log on to this, or Becky, can you share the document? Because I think if I might be able to share, but then I don't see anybody.
I know, I'll share it.
I might actually go with sharing it, Becky, just so I can scroll down and speak. So, all right, do you all see my screen here? All right. So the youth safeguarding policy, there are some standard items we include in most policy samples. First is an introduction, a little bit of why this exists, so that you or other mentors, parents might be able to note some of the importance behind why. Then we move into the purpose of this policy, again, for protection, safeguarding the integrity of the mentor-mentee relationship. I'm gonna go quick. I'm not gonna read every part of this. So the next part is definitions. Misconduct. We're hopefully putting some very specific words around what constitutes misconduct and what it does not. And I've actually found many policies currently do not have emotional misconduct or spiritual misconduct involved in them or defining them. And so the sexual misconduct, I also want to point out the grooming process. And I've also found in some situations, a minor might be groomed and nothing is enacted on until that minor becomes an adult. Just something to point out. So when we're talking about sexual misconduct, it might be reportable down the line if the grooming actually started when somebody was a minor, or eventually they were exploited by somebody with that major power differential. Moving on to emotional misconduct. This is a definition that we're continuing to work with, which might be approved by at least the Christian Reformed Church's synod soon, to use specifically for some processes that we have. And so a pattern, and you'll see a pattern is very key to defining emotional misconduct, a pattern of behavior of insulting, humiliating, manipulating, generally instilling fear in an individual in order to control them. Often the individual's reality becomes distorted as they internalize the abuse as their own failings. And so there's a lot there that we can unpack, but I'm going to continue down to spiritual misconduct. Again, a pattern of exerting power and control over someone using some spirituality, religion, faith, beliefs in ways that compromise their well-being and flourishing. One key item of spiritual misconduct, which might happen in a mentoring relationship, is just of telling somebody that they have to listen to God, even though God's voice for them, maybe in a different area of their life, that they themselves need to just do better, be more obedient, do more in just listening to God, and stop worrying about something. In some ways, that might be just poor spiritual care, but maybe manifested in a way of somebody else using their spirituality over somebody. Obviously, there's always so much more going on in situations, and so I don't like to just say that, but spiritual misconduct is here to defined there, to give more around that. And then concepts of power, abuse of power, we've also defined them, and I'll leave if you have questions, you can ask them at the end. The key part of the policy is policy for program directors and then for mentors. So if you just look at this policy and see, okay, this is what the program director is required to do according to the policy, and the other item is what mentors are required to do. And so the key items we've included here and in this draft is about the training that you would be here with us tonight, or a part of other trainings that come down the line when we have more time to develop a specific training on boundaries, power dynamics, and prevention of abuse. The next is agreements that you would be in charge of, how a mentor signs up to be a mentor, what they agree to, and also ensuring that they sign something like the code of conduct, which is also included in this policy. Next, safe spaces. You'd be in charge of safe space where there's a public space. That's one of the key things, that it's public, and it can happen, either at a different public venue or at the church location. So, and I also realize there can be a public space, but no one else is there, right? Like sometimes our churches are empty, even though it's public. And so to ensure that there is other people around, I think, in that space to ensure that it really does feel like that other people can help and see, and there's a level of accountability going on. Logs of mentoring ministries. We really struggled over this at this point of how logs are kept, but we really do believe once there is a log, it creates a level of transparency that can't be had in any other form. And so the log itself of how people are logging it could differ. We put in here that it might be a physical sign in, sign out. Sometimes that's just the easiest, or an SMS text. A mentor director knows when it starts, when it's done, or a use of a mentoring log app. And this is something that Amanda is, she's gung-ho about making an app for you all that you can download on your iPhones and your Androids, and very easy. I think it might be a little involved. So we'll find out how we can develop an app like that. Or a completion of a Google form as well could be used. But something that records that this is both started and stopped, and creates a level of transparency and accountability. Orientation and check-ins with mentees. We found this was really important to create a connection with those who are being mentored, so that they have somebody else to go to, depending on how the mentoring relationship is going. And there's some kind of, like, after 1 month check-in, then 3 months, then 6 months. Quick check-in. How's this going? Any feedback? Do you have any questions? Any concerns? Could be a quick conversation after church, or an email, or something like that. Confidentiality. that there is, and I think this is important just to ensure that there is a proper expectation around how things are held in confidence. If you have one mentor who's hearing some things that are going on in somebody's family, that needs to be held in confidence. They can't be sharing that with other people. And I think that's just a key that we found to trauma-informed ministry, that there needs to be a level of support and trust, and that trust needs to be held, especially in that mentoring relationship, until there might be something that a real cause for concern. And so we've put in there about how to respond to abuse if that comes up, or if there is a reason to suspect abuse or neglect happening in a person's life. That would be something that wouldn't necessarily be held in confidentiality. And then we elaborate a bit more about responding to abuse and how that happens. And we've talked a little bit about that as well already tonight. And then so that's the policy for mentoring directors. And then we go to policy for mentors. So it's all many of the same things are here. It just requires for that key mentor as opposed to the director. So training, agreements, transparency, and logging of mentoring meetings. Transportation is a new one here for mentors, because they would be the person who would likely be asked if there needs to be transportation. And we've provided some provisions that it could happen if there's no other alternative. Okay, so if there is no other alternative, then clear consent is received from parents of the mentee if they're a minor. And this is all a policy geared towards those who are being mentored who are minors. And then there's a clear recorded communication, SMS or email, sent to the program director at the beginning of the time the mentor is alone in the car, and then with the mentee, and then a follow-up communication once they've dropped them off, so that it's logged, it's there, people know there's accountability and transparency. Propriety and behavior. This is could be summed up quite a bit by the code of conduct, which talks, it goes more in depth to the level of power and how that's stewarded for the flourishing of others, and when things are not appropriate. But then we put in specific items that are related to a mentor-mentee relationship, which has to do with maybe the uniqueness of the differences between the mentee and mentor, and some other items related to substances, and how to just some key things, just to give mentors a guideline of what's appropriate when full-on hug. We've often have a situation where somebody lingers in a hug. They might not mean anything by it, but it sure is a boundary that some people might say, this is actually not what I want, or they might not consent to it. So it's very easy for a mentor to say, hey, can I give you a hug? Or, it's not too hard to do. And so to ensure that there's some kind of clear consent that when there is an exchange in that way. So going to move on to guidelines for electronic communication, emailing or texting. We've already talked a little bit about this, but communication we mentioned in here shouldn't take place between the hours of 9 and 7 a.m. They're encouraged to establish expectations about electronic communication. So they have a conversation. What is the best way to contact you, and figure out what the healthy boundaries are. Both parents and guardians mentoring director should be informed by the mentor at the beginning of the mentoring relationship how electronic communication will be used to facilitate the relationship. And if they express any concerns, then the program director then would work with the mentor to establish a plan for electronic communication. Next, social media. A lot of this is guided by consent and permission, rather than just taking a picture, throwing it on Facebook. It's very easy to say, can I take a picture and put this on my Facebook page? Especially if the mentor is the one who's taking the picture or sharing information on social media. And then confidentiality, we've already mentioned. And then a bit more guidance around how to respond to abuse as well. And that's the gist of the policy. So I made it through, might have taken 10 minutes or a bit more. And then we have some other resources here of how applicants can apply. And I think you could use this, or if you have a better route through your own resources, you can use those too. And then we also have the code of conduct embedded in this policy as well, which with the several different topics of appropriate boundaries and conduct. And then finally, yeah, we also have this helpful guide. This is questions for understanding power dynamics and boundaries. Some things are just to ask these questions. How would my actions be perceived if they were made public? If you do something behind closed doors, it's one thing. If you do it in front of a group, people realize, oh, I probably shouldn't have done that. So these are just some tests to understand if your boundaries are appropriate or not. I just really love Diane Langberg. She's a psychologist and a counselor to so many people who have been victimized by abuse at the hands of clergy, and she's walked with so many people, and she makes this quote on power, which I think sums up so much of healthy boundaries, is that fragilities and weaknesses do not necessarily remove our power at all. They do, however, make us more likely to use our power destructively. The weaker and needier we feel, the more dangerous we are in a position of power, because we are far more likely to neglect or use the sheep under our care to feed ourselves. Those who feel powerless or inadequate often abuse power. And so when we have a relationship between a mentor and a mentee, if the mentor starts receiving more for their own gain in that relationship, whether it's in their own relational needs, that's a reason to be a bit concerned that that mentor actually is receiving different needs from somebody who has in that kind of relationship, which is not the place to receive what you need. So, and then finally, the last item here, indicators of a child's potential need for protection, and different things to note, that signs and symptoms of that somebody may be experiencing abuse in their life. I'm going to stop the share and open it up to questions or comments.
I just want to say thank you. This is a very well-designed policy. I've worked with I helped write the very first policies that were used for Safe Church many, many years, 1992, I think, or something. It has become so much more defined, and I just want to thank you for your work.
Thanks, Ellie.
You never know when you get to the end, like, of a class. I used to teach in a seminary, and like there's just dead silence, whether you've put everybody to sleep or you've just wowed the socks off of everybody. So,
I think it was really clear, and there's some great examples, a lot of good points to think on, and there was no confusion for us. So I think we just don't have any questions, but it was a really great presentation. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for saying that.
I really hope as you process all of this, one of the best places to process this in person and in context with your own Safe Church policy is with your coaches. So we are here. Myself, Ron is not with us tonight, and our other coach, Wendy, to help you take this document, take what you currently have around Safe Church policies in your context, and see what are some really good, helpful language and resources that complement each other well, that we can use to undergird our work. So I totally understand if you're like, I don't even know how to process all of this. This is a lot. And I see it on your faces because it's on my face too. So know that we will be processing this with you as we move along.
Yeah, and I guess I want to just offer, like our office is available. If you want to ask questions or follow up on anything that we've said tonight, as Chris noted in the chat, it's a lot of information, and it's not easy information, right? Like, so I know for myself, often when I have to engage in this material, I'm processing things myself, not just in my head, but in my heart. And so I'm mindful of that is probably part of your experience here tonight as well. So do not hesitate to reach out to us. We're on the CRCNA webpage. You can find our information there. One of the easiest ways to remember how to contact us is Safe Church Ministry, one word, Safe Church Ministry at crcna.org. And that email comes to me. So feel free to reach out for follow-up or just questions. We're happy to help.
I have a question. First of all, this was a wonderful presentation. Even though it was an hour and a half, it just flew by. and yeah, it was, really appreciated. What I'm wondering about is, we're going just briefly through the policy that we just did. Would you suggest, like we do have our own church policy that's like pages and pages and pages long. Would you suggest bringing this policy to our council and asking them to kind of give it their stamp of approval as an addition for specifically for the Generation Spark program?
Maybe I'll take that one. I think as an official program of your church that Generation Spark is doing, I think the council has a role as those who are leading the church and especially responsible for the ministry itself. And so I think that it would be really good for them to say, yes, this is what we're agreeing to, and this is a really good way for our this mentoring ministry to go forward. Without their approval, you may run into just some challenges around expectations and at the end of the day, you know, we often think about policies and think about the legal implications. And there are legal implications for a church who does not do the policy that they are taking on. And so that's where we would say that we would really hope the council would say, yes, we're going to do this, and make sure that all the pieces are accounted for. And if you need more resources, hopefully they could figure out ways to help you carry this out in a way that's really healthy.
Perfect, thanks.
I'm looking at the clock. So I am going to hold us to our commitment to you all, which is that we're going to start on time and end on time. And so I just want to finish by a little housekeeping, Generation Spark housekeeping. So turn on your Generation Spark headphones. Again, let's just give a quick snaps round of applause for Eric, Becky, and Amanda. You guys, thank you, thank you, thank you. We are so grateful to you. So I did want to say that by the end of this month in March, our hope is that you will have completed the Generation Spark Director training. There are 2 large modules that are a part of Generation Spark, the Director training and then the launching of Generation Spark. That second module you will get access to in the next couple of weeks after March has completed. You may launch Generation Spark whenever it is appropriate for you. We do not know your ministries like you know your ministries. In my personal ministry, it would be haphazard to launch something in the summertime. So we often launch things in the fall. So it is up to you on how and when you want to launch Generation Spark. That material, though, will be open and available for you beginning in April so that you can access it, get aware of what you need, start meeting with your team. That is our hope. Once you have a director in place, you will start to build out a team of volunteers who will help you lead Generation Spark in your community. Secondly, I am so excited. My CRC friends know the pain that we have experienced because we have been trying to create an in-person gathering of which we will give you free food, free travel, free lodging in the beautiful state of Minnesota. And we are committed to some dates. So I just wanted to give you a save the date, COVID contingent, from our mouths to God's ears, October 13 through 15. Put it on your calendars. We're going to send it in more emails, but this is your friendly save the date, verbal save the date. Erica is working diligently to find us a sweet space to be together. We are promising it will not be a church basement. We promise there will be windows and there will be good food. So that being said, those are the two big things that we needed you to know. And then lastly, you have coaches. Ruth has mentioned them. Ruth, Ron, and Wendy. They are here for you. Lean into them. Talk to them. Even if you don't need them, respond to them. It would be helpful for them to know that you're doing okay. So if you're watching the recording, hopefully you caught all these final details at the very end. Thank you so much for your time. We are so grateful.